Hello everyone, how is it going? This is Ahmed Inaya, and in this video I will talk about configuring basic management for Cisco switches. Let's talk first about different way to access CLI of a switch. CLI stands for Command Line Interface, and the switch CLI can be accessed by different ways. First of all, you can access it using console or console cable, which needs direct connectivity to the switch to connect to console port. This connectivity uses serial cable or USB cables, and these cables are limited in distance. So to access the switch by console, you should be in the same physical location or same room as the switch and connect directly to the switch console. It is not easy to connect directly to the switch in many cases, and that's why it is common to use remote access to configure and manage switches. You can access switch CLI also by connecting remotely to the switch using IP address of the switch. This can be done using Telnet, which is plain text no encryption protocol. This means the traffic between you and the switch will be sent plain text over the network, and if anyone is able to capture this traffic, he would be able also to read the commands you send to the switch and to read the output back from the switch to you. That's why it is recommended to avoid using Telnet and to use SSH instead. SSH is similar to Telnet. It provides remote access to switch CLI, but SSH encrypts the traffic, so this is more secure to manage the switch. In this video, we will talk about configuring SSH to manage the switch, as this is the recommended way to connect remotely to switches. Switches can be managed also by different ways other than CLI. For example, switches can be managed using GUI or graphical user interface, and they can manage also using API, which is used for automation or programmability. In this video, I will talk mainly about CLI access remotely to the switch using SSH, which is the common method by network engineers to access the switches and manage them remotely. To configure SSH access, we need to follow these steps. First, we should configure IP address and gateway for the switch. IP address is needed to connect to the switch by Telnet or SSH, and gateway is needed if you want to connect to the switch from different subnet or different network. In the second step, we should configure host name and domain name, and these parameters are needed to identify the switch when generating SSH key, as we will discuss later in this video. So once we configure host name and domain name, we will be ready to generate SSH key, which is the third step to configure SSH access. After generating SSH key, we are ready to enable SSH in VTY lines, and this is step number 4. And before being able to access the switch by SSH, we should configure SSH authentication. So let's start by configuring a switch IP address. Switch IP address can be static or dynamic. For a static IP address, you need to configure IP address for the switch, subnet mask, and gateway to reach this switch from other subnets in the network. We will talk more about IP addresses and subnet masks in other videos, but for now, you need to know that these parameters should be configured to get access to the switch remotely. The commands to configure IP address are here, so we should be in enable mode or privileged mode. Then we should type configure terminal to go to global configuration mode. From global configuration mode, we write interface VLAN 1 to go to interface VLAN 1 submode, and once we are in VLAN 1 submode, we issue the command no shutdown, because by default interface VLAN is shut down, and then we configure the IP address as per this command. If you want to configure the IP address using DHCP, we should have a DHCP server in the network, and the command is as follow. We should go to configure terminal, and then we should go to VLAN 1 submode, and within VLAN 1 submode we start by no shutdown, and then we configure the IP address to be DHCP. In the second step, we should configure host name and domain name. These parameters are needed for SSH key to be generated. Domain name is the one you have in your network, and usually it is the same for all other devices in the network, but for host name, it should be unique to the switch. When it comes to host name, it is recommended to configure meaningful host name that reflects the location, the function, or other parameters of the switch. For example, it is common to call switches by the location of the switch, like switch 1 floor 1 and switch 2 floor 1, for example, or by the function of the switch, like access switch 1, distribution switch 1, core switch 1. Usually, naming convention is different from one network or from one enterprise to another, but if you have one in your organization, you can apply it to switch names also. The switch name can be something simple, like switch 1 for example, and in my case, I can configure the domain as lab.com, but in a production network, this should be the same domain name you have for other devices in your network. Once we have the host name and domain name configured, we can generate SSH key. SSH key is needed to encrypt the traffic between the host and the switch, and it can be of different sizes from 360 to 2048 bits. The longer or the larger the key, the more secure, but this needs more resources. Nowadays, most switches have more resources than before, and you may go for 2048 without significant impact on the switch. The process to generate SSH key is as follows. You start by going to configure terminal, and then you issue this command. The switch asks you for the key length, and in my case I will go for 2048 because this is more secure. So once you have the key generated and IP addresses, host name and domain configured, you need to enable SSH in VTY lines. Each switch has 16 VTY or virtual teletype lines. These VTY lines are used for remote access, whether being Telnet or SSH. VTY lines can be configured to reject all remote CLI access to the switch. So in some cases, you want to configure the switch to be managed only using console and not any remote access. This is not common, and most engineers, they want to be able to manage switches remotely. VTY lines can be configured also to accept all remote protocols, Telnet and SSH, but as we discussed before, Telnet is not encrypted. VTY lines can be configured also to accept one protocol only, which is Telnet or SSH. But as we discussed before, it is recommended to enable SSH only and disable Telnet because SSH is more secure than Telnet. For additional security, you can configure ACLs or access control lists to allow remote access from certain subnet or certain network only. ACLs will be discussed more in another video, but for now, it is enough to know that ACLs can be used to provide more security over VTY lines. So this is the command. You should start by going to configure terminal, and then you go to VTY 015 to access VTY submode. Within VTY submode, you type this command, transport input, and you choose the option whether to enable all protocols, to disable all protocols, or to enable SSH or Telnet only. And as we discussed, it is recommended to enable SSH only and disable any other protocol. Before connecting remotely using SSH, there should be a way configured in the switch to authenticate remote users. SSH needs username and password authentication, so it is not enough to configure password only. Password only is enough for Telnet, but for SSH it needs username and password to be enabled for authentication. This username and password can be configured locally in the switch or can be configured remotely using external database like Active Directory, for example. If you are using remote database to authenticate users, you need a protocol to communicate with this database. It is common to use Radius or TACACS in this case, but this needs external server or multiple external servers to store user information and to communicate with the switch using Radius or TACACS. If you are using local authentication or local username password, these are the commands you need to type in the switch. You should go to configure terminal or conft for abbreviation. Then you need to configure username and password in the switch, and you need to assign the privilege level for this user. As discussed before, the switch has privilege level from 0 to 15, where 15 is the maximum privilege. So if you want this user to get full access, you need to provide him with the privilege 15. After creating the username and password, you need to go to VTY submode, and from VTY submode, you type this command, login local, to enable login access to VTY and to direct VTY to use local database when authenticating users. After completing this step, you will be ready to connect to the switch using SSH by connecting to the IP address of this switch. I hope this video was useful to you. If you find this video useful, please don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and enable notification to receive my future videos. Thank you and have a good day.